الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا محمد حبيب رب العالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on Mutammima al-Ajrumiyya, we have reached المفعول المطلق, باب المفعول المطلق, and this is in the section on the nawasib, right? On what puts those things that what's called al-mansubat min al-asma, bab al-mansubat, right? So it's a section on the mansubat of the asma. Of them is al-maf'ul al-mutlaq. What is this section called in the Ajrumiyya? Called Bab al-Masdar, right? So he changed the title, right? Because al-Masdar is a broader concept. Al-Maf'ul al-Mutlaq is a particular type of this. So this is from the changes made to the Ajrumiyya. And some of these changes, as we mentioned, are good to go back and annotate your copy of the Ajrumiyya with, not to change the Ajrumiyya, but to know where things can be tightened. And why is it called maf'ul mutlaq? Why is this expression used? Right? He explains, right, that so he gives a definition in the Mutammima itself about the maf'ul mutlaq, right? It's called al-maf'ul al-mutlaq because it is not specified by one is not non-muqayyad bil-jar لصحة, says أي الذي لم يقيد بالجار لصحة إطلاق المفعول عليه من غير تقييد, right? So مفعول مطلق, why? Because what's the most common مفعول? مفعول به, right? So that's the jar, right? The مفعول مطلق, this is the unconditional مفعول, the unconditional object, in the sense that the مفعول به is the one it's done to. Al-maf'ul ma'ahu, right? These all are muqayyad, right? Maf'ul ma'ahu, which I think that's the next section, right? Right? Or maf'ul fihi, right? Etc. So maf'ul mutlaq is unconditioned by these considerations, right? And so it explains لأنه المفعول الحقيقي, right? It is the real maf'ul. Right? And what does it express? الذي فعله الفاعل. Right? الذي فعله فاعل الفعل. This is the meaning of the verb expressing the action of the one who did the action. Right? So if you see, for example, كلم الله موسى تكليما. So what is تكليم? That is a مفعول مطلق, right? The maf'ul bihi expresses who the action was done to, right? The maf'ul ma'ahu expresses who the action done with. But the maf'ul al-mutlaq expresses the action that was done, right? So to speak. Right? And this is an important thing that always wonder about the meaning. Like, what is this about? So, people can tell you 10 things about the maf'ul al-mutlaq, but they can't tell you, okay, so what is the maf'ul mutlaq? They can parrot the definition. Great, thank you. I read that too. Okay? But what is it? Why is it called maf'ul mutlaq? Because this is the action, it expresses the action unconditionally, not who the action was done to, etc. And it's mentioned for different purposes, right? So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, right? So the author of the Mutammima, rahimahullah ta'ala, tells us, هو المصدر الفضل هو المصدر الفضلة المؤكد لعامله أو المبين لنوعه أو عدده. Right? So هو المصدر الفضلة. Right? It is the masdar that is extra. Right? Right? And the fadla is ما لا يكون عمدة في الكلام. Right? It is not from the foundation of the sentence. Right? It is not the fi'l or the fa'il, and it's not the mubtada or the khabar, right? Or that which takes the place of these. Right? The umda of the sentence is mubtada khabar, or fi'l and fa'il, or that which takes the place of these. Right? So it's al-masdar, al-fadla. Right? It's the masdar that is fadla. It's a non-essential element of a non-foundational element of the sentence. And then it explains, what does this masdar do? And we'll touch upon the masdar in a second. Al-mu'akkidu li'amilihi. It does one of three things. Right? And in the section he'll break these down. So it is a masdar that is mentioned. It's a masdar that is non-fundamental, that either emphasizes its amil أو المبين لنوعه, or clarifies its type, or clarifies its number. Here, while for students of knowledge, we have discouraged dipping too much into al-Ahdal's commentary, because it can be overwhelming. However, in some circumstances, al-Ahdal's commentary is very useful. One of the things he does here, and of course in the Mutammima itself, a definition is coming of the masdar, right? Right? So the maf'ul al-mutlaq is a masdar. What is the masdar? Right? هو اسم ما فعله فاعل فعل مذكور. Right? The masdar is the name of the action done by a doer. Right? Right? Either mentioned or implicit. Either the person was mentioned or they were implicit. Right? So this is a useful definition, right? And he gives some clarifications there for the purpose of accuracy. Okay, so this masdar, why does this come? It comes for three purposes, right? The first is فالمؤكد لعامله. It emphasizes its amil, its agent. نحو وكلم الله موسى تكليما. Right? Right? كلم الله موسى تكليما. Right? Allah spoke to Musa with speaking. Taklima is the masdar, and its role is ta'keed. Right? It's ta'keed. So كلم فعل ماض. Right? لفظ الجلالة الله فاعل مرفوع. موسى مفعول به. Right? بفتحة مقدرة. مفعول به منصوب بفتحة مقدرة. تكليمة is a مفعول مطلق مؤكد of what? Of كلمة. Right? And there are rules related to the masdar and how it operates, and when you put it in dual and plural, which al-Fakihi, which the author of the Mutammima steers away from. You should just know that there are extra rules. They come in the next stage, but just be aware of it. So that's al-muakkidu li'amilihi, right? Another example, right? You say أعجبني ضربك أعجبني ضربك لزيد ضربا, right? I was impressed by أعجبني ضربك لزيد. I was impressed by your hitting of Zayd with a real hit, ضربا, right? Why? Because ضرب, hitting, could be used metaphorically, for example. So one of the things that ta'keed does is it does nafi iradat al-majaz, for example, right? Okay, so this is one category. The other is وَالْمُبَيِّنُ لِنَوْعِ عَامِلِهِ. Sorry, the second, yeah. وَالْمُبَيِّنُ لِنَوْعِ عَامِلِهِ نَحْوُ فَأَخَذْنَاهُمْ أَخْذَ عَزِيزٍ مُقْتَدِرٍ. نسأل الله السلامة. Right? And so we took them with the taking of one triumphant and truly able, right? أخذناهم أخذ عزيز مقتدر. أخذناهم is فعل and مفعول, right? أخذناهم, right? فعل فاعل مفعول. You can see the تفصيل of the إعراب of that. أخذ is what? Is مفعول مطلق, right? Right? Is مفعول مطلق, and it's منصوب. It's مؤكد لعامله, which is أخذنا, which is أخذ, أخذناهم. So it makes تأكيد of it, right? أخذناهم, we took them, right? أخذناهم أخذ عزيز مقتدر. This makes تبيين of, this clarifies نوع العمل. What kind of أخذ? We took them. أخذ عزيز, with the taking of one triumphant, tremendous, مقتدر, all able. It's really scary. From Surah Al-Qamar. Another example from the Quran is أن أعمل صالحا. أن أعمل, كيف تعمل, right? أن يعمل, عفوا أن يعمل أن أعمل, was it أن أعمل صالحا, right?
Yeah. وأن أعمل صالحا.
It's scandalous. أن يعمل صالحا, no, it's أن أعمل, right? No, because when there's an error in the Quranic verse, right, that's really like, something like this, properly speaking, an edition like this has to be banned from circulation, right? Like to have errors in the Quran in a printed edition, you have the publisher, in Muslims, like in proper society, publishers have to just, simple, they have to just be banned. If you publish books with errors and certain errors, okay, the ulama should, but the authorities, like errors in Quran, right? Repeated errors in text of the hadith, that this is, right? And أعمل صالحا, right? Is another example, right? Right? What kind of an أعمل, أي عمل, أي نوع من العمل? Of course, something implicit. عملا صالحا, right? So that's the second kind. It clarifies the type of action. وقولك ونحو قولك ضربت زيدا ضرب الأمير. I struck Zayd with the striking of a governor. Like you didn't just like hit him, you hung him up for hitting, right? Poor Zayd. والثالث والمبين لعدد عامله. Right? It clarifies the number of the action. فدكتا دكة واحدة. Right? Right? Did I miss something? Right? They were shaken with one shaking. Right? They were shaken with one singular shaking. Right? So dukkata is فعل النائب الفاعل dukkata. Right? They were shaken. Right? The fa'il is not mentioned. dukkata. You know, it's a fi'l with the نائب الفاعل. And the ta is علامة التأنيث. The alif is of تثنية. Right? And the ضمير المتصل of تثنية is في محل رفع نائب فاعل. It's in the place of the فاعل. Right? فدكتا دكة واحدة. دكة is, what is it? دكة is مفعول مطلق. واحدة صفة. دكة دكة واحدة. دكة points here to what? The number of times they were shaken. فدكة دكة واحدة. وقولك ضربت زيدا ضربتين. I hit Zayd with two hittings. ضربتين. So ضربتين is مفعول مطلق. Right? منصوب علامة نصبه كذا. جيء به لبيان عدده. يعني لبيان عدد عامله. Right? So that's pretty straightforward. وهو أي المفعول المطلق قسمان لفظي ومعنوي. فإن وافق لفظ فعله، أي إن وافق المفعول المطلق لفظ فعله فهو لفظي كما تقدم. So المفعول المطلق is two types, لفظي and معنوي. It's لفظي if the wording of the مفعول المطلق corresponds to the wording of its فعل, which is its عامل كما تقدم. وإن وافق معنى فعله أي دون لفظه فهو معنوي. And if it corresponds to the meaning of its فعل but not its words, it is معنوي. نحو جلست قعودا. I sat sitting on the ground. Right? جلس, because جلس, you know, sitting has a number of ways. Right? But جلوس and قعود have a similar meaning. Right? So here جلست قعودا, so it corresponds in the meaning, but this would be its معنوي. And what type of مفعول مطلق is it? المبين لنوعه. Right? Right? What's نوع الجلوس؟ القعود. جلست قعودا. I sat sitting on the ground. قعد, because جلست you could be على كرسي, على تخت. Right? على فراش. jalastu, could be in different ways, right? So, وَقُمْتُ وُقُوفًا, right? قُمْتُ وُقُوفًا. I stood, standing still, right? Right? So this is considered a مفعول مطلق معنوي right? Now, there's some discussion on this, right? About what is the relation between julus and qu'ud. And this is explained by al-Ahdal, and it's of interest because it has legal implications as well. So he quotes, actually, this is why he quotes it from a book of hadith commentary, Sharh al-Masabih. Yeah, and you can read that. Qumtu wuqufan, etc. Right? And this is why al-Ahdal, the Kawakib, is very useful as well, because the books he relies upon are great books, right? So like the Sharh al-Masabih, for example, he's relying on. Of course, you could find out from earlier in the text. Usually, very often, the ulama, when they mention something first time, because there's a number of great shuruh on the Masabih. Ibn Malak and al-Baydawi and a bunch of others. But, so you look the first time they're mentioned, right? He's likely mentioned which one, right? There's another way of doing it, which is to go and look at the various shuruh in the same, and where would you find it in those, but that's a more laborious process. He mentions a useful thing about the qamus, because then he quotes Raghib al-Isfahani from his mufradat, right? About qu'ud and julus. Thirdly, he quotes the qamus al-Muhit of al-Fayruzabadi, the great dictionary, right? And so the point is that what's in the Mutammima, that this is, that julus and qu'ud are broadly synonymous, right? And for something to be a synonym of another, it does not have to fully correspond to the meaning, right? The dilala, they have to have broadly overlapping meaning. That's enough for something to be mutaradif, right? But they have distinct shades of meaning. So frequently you'll see the maf'ul al-mutlaq used where it broadly corresponds to meaning, but it frequently brings out the type of the fi'l, right? Because he said, jalastu julusan, I really sat down. But jalastu qu'udan, because they do overlap, but qu'ud generally indicates on the ground. Qumtu qiyaman, I stood up. But qama and waqafa are synonymous, correct? They're broadly synonymous. But waqafa indicates standing, but what? Remaining standing. So I stood up. If you say qumtu qiyaman, I stood. But say qumtu wuqufan, I stood, as if you say standing still. Wuqufan, right? But then al-Ahdal has a very interesting point, right? He says وفي القاموس القعود الجلوس, right? And he mentions some details about it. You can read them. And then this is an important fa'idah. He says, can you read وَمِنْ قَاعِدَتِهِ?
ومن قاعدته أن المشهور المعروف في اللغة هو الذي يصدر به كلامه
يصدر
والذي يصدر به كلامه ثم يعطف عليه ما دونه من الأقوال بأو.
Okay, so this is a fa'idah, right? He says that min qa'idatihi, that from the habits of Sahib al-Qamus, right? And this is a great grammarian telling you that, and these things one can confirm by others, right? But any book that one approaches, it helps to see what are the adat of that author. That's why one pays attention to their muqaddimah. Sometimes it's useful, even if you're approaching it by studying one text, to see what are good introductions to this book, to go through, because sometimes other commentaries, even if you're not studying it, what will the other commentary do? It will tell you, they're often called mafatih, right? And many people wrote, for example, النافع الكبير لمن يطالع الجامع الصغير of Imam al-Lakhnawi wrote a guide to the one who wants to study or read al-Jami' al-Saghir of Imam Muhammad al-Hasan. Similarly, on the Hidayah, many people wrote guides for one who's going to study the Hidayah. There's we're teaching the Shifa here at Seekers Guidance Canada during Ramadan, and we broadcast globally. There's a number of books that are introductions to the Shifa. There's actually similarly introductions to the Ajrumiyya, right? What do these do? They give you insights, and sometimes you don't read. Sometimes that's one of the benefits of a larger commentary. You may not actually read it, but you'll find points of benefit in it that help guide one. But here, this is a useful point, that the Qamus al-Muhit al-Firozabadi tends to mention the meaning that he considers to be the mashhur, the famous meaning, or the strongest meaning, the primary meaning first. Then he says, or this. These are secondary usages or less common. Okay. That's a fa'idah, right? قمت وقوفا, right? And similarly, right? So then he tells us about what is the masdar? Right? What is the masdar? Right? Because the maf'ul al-mutlaq, and here, of course, he's pointing to the fact that what Imam Ibn Ajurrum referred to as the masdar, is called a babul masdar, right? The maf'ul al-mutlaq is one usage of the masdar. And how did Imam Ibn Ajurrum define the masdar itself? Yeah. So he gave a beginner's definition of the masdar, right? Which is that it is هو الاسم الذي يجيء ثالثا في تصريف الفعل, right? It's an ism that comes third when you make tasrif. ضرب يضرب ضربا is that third thing. Why? Because المبتدئ من ليس لديه قدرة على تصور معاني هذا العلم. The complete beginner is someone who cannot conceive of the meanings of the science. So you can't define things for him by the realities of those things, because he doesn't know the realities, right? So that's why simpler definitions are sometimes needed. Because it's not a aib at that level, right? So but now someone's covered the basics, understood them in their study of the Ajrumiyya or equivalent. Now, the author of the Mutammima tells us, وَالْمَصْدَرُ هو اسم الحدث الصادر من الفاعل. Right? The masdar is the name for the action that occurred from the fa'il, from the doer. Right? It's the name of the action. So it's a name for the action. Right? So هو اسمه معنى الفعل دون زمن حدوثه. Right? So the fi'l indicates what?
The meaning and time.
Yeah. It indicates. So what's the definition of الفعل هو? Yeah. The fi'l is كلمة دلت على معنى الفعل مقترنا ب زمن وقوعه وضعا. Right? Right? The fi'l is a word, it's a كلمة دلت على, that indicates the meaning of معنى الحدث, the meaning of an action, and in its form indicates the time of its occurrence, to distinguish it from ظرف زمان, etc. Right? The masdar, so the fi'l indicates, has two parts. The masdar is an ism that indicates the meaning of the fi'l, but doesn't in its structure indicate the time of its taking place. Right? And the masdar, there's all kinds of discussions on it. Right? Right? And you can see a number of definitions shared in Maulana al-Fakihi, Maulana al-Ahdal. Right? And so for example, you have غسل indicates an action. So غسل is كلمة دلت على الحدث. Right? مقترنا بزمن وقوعه وضعا. غسل or يغسل. It indicates the حدث, the occurrence, washing, but with the time. ماضي, مضارع, and even the fi'l. اغسل is connected with time, now or after. Right? But غسل, it indicates the meaning of the action. دون زمن وقوعه. غسل الوجه. متى? We're not talking about that. We're talking about the meaning. And this has rhetorical implications, right? What's the verse again? لله على الناس حج البيت. Now, why is it expressed in this way? There are rhetorical implications of these forms. Now, we're not going to go into that, right, here. But that's why we study the grammar, because these forms bring out meanings, right? And honestly, Imam al-Ghazali said, you cannot trust the knowledge of someone who hasn't studied logic. Like someone who doesn't know the ulum al-ala, you can't trust their knowledge. Like who hasn't studied the ulum al-ala, but who doesn't have some kind of command of the ulum al-ala. They're just a parrot. Now parrots are good for decoration, right? But they cannot do anything fundamental in your life. Okay. So he says, واسم الحدث الصادر من الفعل. It's a name for the action that occurs, that is done by the actor. Right? So you say, قعدت قعودا. Right? I sat with sitting. Sitting, قعودا is the masdar. Right? مات موتا. مات is فعل. موتا is the masdar. وتقريبه. Drawing it closer to the meaning, to the understanding of the beginner. Right? تقريبا للمبتدئ. Right? Is أن يقال هو الذي يجيء ثالثا في تصريف الفعل. It's what comes third in the تصريف of the أفعال. Because people learn the sarf charts, so that this thing that comes third, typically, because they do ماضي مضارع and then مصدر. Right? Right? نحو ضرب يضرب ضربا. Right? ضرب ماضي يضرب مضارع ضربا. Right? And he does this for توضيح. Right? Here مولانا al-Ahdal sort of summarizes a big discussion, and we've touched upon it before in passing, that this has even theological implications and all kinds of implications. That والصحيح أن المصدر هو الأصل وما عداه مشتق منه. Right? Right? And the sound opinion is that the masdar is the origin, everything is derived from it. So the fi'l comes from the masdar, not the other way around. What came before, the chicken or the egg? And what became for the masdar or the fi'l? We say, according to al-Ahdal, what came first? The meaning came first, and then the action came from the meaning. Because what is ghasl? What is غسل? غسل is وقوع الغسل في زمن الماضي. Right? Because لا يتصور المعنى المركب دون جزئه. That you can't think of a composite meaning without first affirming what makes it up. So غسل is made up of غسل في الماضي. Right? That's why it's the sahih. And there's more coming on that in a bit. Right? And those who like theoretical things, there's a lot of discussion on this and back and forth, but this is the hasil. Anyways, وقد تنصب أشياء على المفعول المطلق وإن لم تكن مصدرا وذلك على سبيل النيابة عن المصدر. Certain things could be put up in nasb on the basis that they are the maf'ul al-mutlaq, even though they're not the masdar, because they take the place of the masdar. Right? They're in the place of the masdar. Right? And they point to the masdar. And he gives example. نحو كل وبعض. Right? فلا تميل كل الميل. Right? So كل here is not itself the مفعول المطلق, but right? It's like you could say فلا تميل ميلا كليا. Right? Right? So this is بيان, but it's more brief to say كل الميل. Right? So this is نيابة عن المصدر. Right? فلا تميل, don't incline with complete inclination. This is نوع مبين لنوع لنوع عامله. Right? ولو تقول علينا بعض الأقاويل, if he made up regarding us some, he fabricated regarding us some fabrication. So بعض الأقاويل, right? This is again, so بعض الأقاويل is نائب of the مفعول مطلق, and you can see ولو تقول علينا, right? The واو is حرف عطف لو, right? You can see its إعراب. تقول فعل ماض فاعله is مستتر جوازا تقديره هو. علينا جار ومجرور, right? And you can see its analysis. بعض is مفعول مطلق نائب عن مصدر محذوف, والأصل أن ولو تقول علينا أقاويل قليلة, right? And it's like the مبين لنوع عامله, right? Another example, لا تضروه شيئا, right? Right? So this is one of the things that are نائب عن المصدر. وكالعدد, another thing that's نائب عن would be كالعدد, right? And what's the example? فاجلدوهم 80 جلدة. فثمانين مفعول مطلق, فاجلدوهم 80 جلدة, right? جلدة is تمييز, فاجلدوهم 80, right? And right, so اجلدوا is فعل أمر مبني على حذف النون, واو الجماعة is فاعل, ها is مفعول به, 80 is مفعول مطلق, علامة نصبه الياء نيابة عن الفتحة لأنه محمول على جمع المذكر السالم. And جلدة is تمييز, والتمييز منصوب, etc. Right? So 80 is مفعول مطلق نائب عن مصدر محذوف. Right? So the أصل will be فاجلدوهم جلدا 80. Right? فاجلدوهم جلدا 80. But it's more eloquent in Arabic. فاجلدوهم 80 جلدة. Right? وكأسماء الآلات, right? And for names of the instruments of the actions. الآلات, the instruments for the actions. المعهودة للعمل or للفعل, the ones that are used for the action, such as ضربته صوتا, I struck him with a stick. So as if you said ضربته ضرب صوت, for example, right? أو ضربته ضربا بصوت, right? أو ضربته عصا, أو ضربته مقرع, مقرعة, أعوذ بالله, right? مقرعة is like the rake. There's other, but مقرعة has more than one usage. And there's a few other investigations that go into a lot of detail, but we don't need to get into them. One thing I did in my copy of when I was going through the Kawakib, I just put a note in there because a lengthy discussions. I used to put in the margin, didn't read it, because then when I was reviewing it later, some of those places I wiped it out, right? Because then I did read it. Okay? It wasn't immediately clear what it was for. So if you skip over something, it's good to indicate that you skipped over and you catch it up later. Right? Because it's not directly related to the text. Sometimes the Mashaykh say have economy of. Then you have al-maf'ul fihi. Right? Bab al-maf'ul fihi, which indicates the occurrence when something occurs, right? And these are two, dharf zaman, the time of its occurrence, that which indicates the time of its occurrence, and dharf makan, that which indicates the place of its occurrence, right? And the dharf zaman, and these are mansoob. This is why they're here, right? And you say, and there's a taqdeer of fi in the dharf al-zaman, and there's a taqdeer similarly of fi in dharf al-makan, right? And he gives us a list of what the dharf al-zaman and the dharf al-makan are, right? And then he also tells us that he shares some of the rules that all the asma al-zaman taqbal al-nasb ala al-dharfiyya, right? And he tells us that there's three types of dharf of the asma al-zaman, right? There's some that only indicate the zaman. This is called dharf al-zaman al-mukhtas. And then there's al-ma'dood that indicates that answers kam, right? اعتكفت أسبوعا, for example, right? It's al-ma'dood. It indicates the time, but also it's ma'dood. It tells you how long. Or al-mubham, right? Which does not indicate the specific amount. You say, جلست حينا, I sat for a while. So as ظرف زمان, ظرف زمان مبهم, right? So he gives us these rules. Then he tells us the asma al-makan again is three types, right? The asma al-makan, they accept nasb, right? If they're of three types. You need a place, there's mubham, right? There's non-specific ظرف makan, like the 6 directions. أمام الكعبة. But is there a specific place that's أمام الكعبة? No. It's ظرف makan mubham. Then there's asma al-maqadir, right? That's makan, because indicate place, but for miqdar, right? Like al-mil, sirtu milan, I traveled a mile. And there's also dharf in asma al-makan that is mushtaq, that are derived from the masdar of their doer. You said jalastu majlisa zaydin, right? I sat in this sitting place of Zayd. So this is basically an overview of the section. It's one of the simplest sections of the book. Doesn't need a lot of breakdown. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it. So, babul maf'uli fihi, right? Right, and this is the terminology, of course. وهو المسمى ظرف زمان وظرف المكان, right? Why do you say باب المفعول فيه, right? Because there is distinction between the Kufans and the Basrans on this usage, but this usage was adopted by many of the Basrans, of the who follow the madhab of the Basrans in grammar, right? So you see it in the writings of many of, right? But the terminology of maf'ul fihi was used largely by the Kufans. Right? But for example, many of the Basran scholars, who follow the Basran, which is the mainstream, the approach that preponderated in Arabic grammar. So, Al-Ahdal mentions, for example, that Ibn Hisham, and he's not the only one, you find it many, they use the term maf'ul fihi because it's useful, because when the action takes place, it's time, place, right? So there's two types of dharfs, right? So it's a useful title, it's just terminology, nothing else, right? Some of the differences of the Kufans and Basrans are substantial. Is such and such thing, does such and such thing behave in this way or not? Is this an example of that or not? Is this shadh or is jaiz inda darura, etc.? There's real difference. Sometimes it's just a matter of terminology. They called it this, they called it this. Khafd, jar. Right? Okay. فظرف الزمان هو اسم الزمان المنصوب بتقدير في. It's the name for the time that is in nasb, and there's in meaning as if there's an implicit fi, right? And the ظرف zaman comes first because it's more needed, right? 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 نحو اليوم والليلة وغدوة وبكرة وسحرا وغدا وعتمة وصباحا ومساء وأبدا وأمدا وحينا وعاما وشهرا وأسبوعا وساعة. And these you do well to make a list of these, because some are obvious, we know al-yawm, etc. But some of these, and this is again an example of where al-ahdal is quite useful, right? Because he gives, like what's meant by ghadwatan and bukratan, right? He gives definitions. Saharan, right? So he gives the meanings of these. Ghadan, sahar is akhir al-layl qubayl al-fajr, right? And he gives some nice definitions. When do you say ghadan atamatan, which is the first third of the night. And atama is one of the names also used for Salat al-Isha, right? Sabahan, right? Sabah has multiple usages in Arabic. Abadan, amadan, right? Heen, right, is mubham, sometime, right? Right? Aman, 1 year, and right? Right? And so you could make a list of these, right? Now sa'a, right, is used they say it has 3 primary meanings. Sa'a, it's either a sa'a al-falakiyya, which is the hour that we know, sa'atan, 60 minutes. But they also say وَعَلَى قَدْرِ حلب شاة, the time it takes to milk a sheep. I'm not sure how long it takes to milk a sheep. But it's less than an hour, I hope. Okay. وعلى اللحظة اللطيفة, or for a moment. Right? So for example, some people, there's a famous saying, تفكر ساعة تعدل عبادة 80 سنة. That reflection, some people try to say an hour's reflection is better than the worship of 80 years. But no, it's what's meant by تفكر ساعة أي لحظة. A moment's reflection is worth the worship of. You could probably translate it 80 سنة. A moment's reflection is worth a lifetime's devotion. Meaning without worship, without reflection. So these are the ظرف الزمان, right? Right? And the examples are obvious. Al-Fakihi gives examples for all of them. وظرف المكان هو اسم المكان واسم المكان المنصوب بتقدير فيه. It's the ism for the place in nasb in meaning as if there's a fi there. نحو أمام وخلف وقدام ووراء وفوق وتحت وعند ومع وإزاء وحذاء وتلقاء. وهذه الثلاثة معناها واحد. Right? إزاء and حذاء and تلقاء all means in front of you. وثم, there, with a fatha on the th, right? وهنا, and here, right? And again, you do well to chart these with the meanings, and there are nuances that you'll see in, some of them have more than one sense, right? ثم, it's إشارة للمكان البعيد, right? وهنا إشارة للمعنى للمكان القريب. So what are the rulings of these? He says وجميع أسماء الزمان تقبل النصب على الظرفية. All of the أسماء الزمان, the names of places of times, accept being in nasb in this meaning of ظرفية, of encompassing the meaning of the fi'l. ولا فرق في ذلك, and there's no difference in this, بين المختص منها, between those that are exclusive to it, that indicate time purely, والمعدود, that indicate a duration of time, والمبهم, that indicate non-specified time. ونعني بالمختص ما يقع جوابا لمتى, something that specifically indicates time, it answers the implicit question متى. نحو يوم الخميس, you say يعني زرت زيدا اليوم, متى زرته, right? يوم الخميس, يعني زرت زيدا يوم الخميس. So if you just said it without, زرت زيدا, say متى زرت زيدا يوم الخميس. So there's as if there's a question implicit. تقول صمت يوم الخميس. You say صمت, it says متى صمت, says صمت يوم الخميس. ونعني بالمعدود ما يقع جوابا لكم. And اسم الزمان, that المعدود is that which is an answer of this implicit question, how much. الأسبوع والشهر. تقول اعتكفت أسبوعا. You say اعتكفت. Someone asks كم اعتكفت. Say أسبوعا. Right? سافرت. كم سافرت. سافرت شهرا. Right? ونعني بالمبهم أبهم. This is a very interesting word, but from that you also have bahima, is that which is, and mubham, that which is unspecified, indefinite, right? نعني بالمبهم ما لا يقع جوابا لشيء منها, is that which is answers neither متى, and does not answer كم. When, it doesn't answer when, it doesn't answer how long. كالحين والوقت, right? جلست حينا. And there's a few others, right? ثم لبثت, in the hadith, what is it? ثم لبثت مليا. Right? So, حينا, وقتا. And there's different rhetorical purposes. Why is a non-definite amount being used? Often purposefully. Right? For example, say, صاحبته مدة وكانت أيام جميلة. I kept company of him for a while. Right? One, because you want to shift attention from it. The point isn't like you're trying to, like what are you trying to emphasize? So there's different maqasid of khitab. Because if you say, for example, صاحبته 3 سنوات, then people will be thinking about the number. But the point isn't the 3, right? صاحبته مدة, because you want to highlight something else, right? So the non-definition of something, or something is defined, okay, he felt the need to define that, and it's bringing out meanings, right? وأما أسماء المكان, as for أسماء المكان, فلا ينصب منها على الظرفية إلا 3 أنواع. الأول المبهم كأسماء الجهات. So only 3 types of أسماء المكان. From the أسماء المكان are just names of actual places, right? 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 الأول المبهم, which is ما لا يختص بمكان بعينه. Right? It's that which is not specific to, and Al-Ahdal gives a definition. It's not referring to a specific place, and its reality is not known except relative to what it's being related with. Right? So, كأسماء الجهات, like the names of the directions, الست, وهي فوق وتحت ويمين وشمال وأمام وخلف وأما أشبهها. There, because these are relative places, right? The directions. You just shift. You're in front of me. I turn that way. You're to my right. I turn more. You're behind me. أنت أمامي على يعني جلست أمام عمر, جلست يمين عمر, جلست وراء عمر, etc. وأسماء المقادير, the names of extents of مكان, كالميل والفرسخ والبريد, نحو سرت ميلا, سافرت فرسخا. Right? الثالث ما كان مشتقا من مصدر عامله. The third is that the name for the place that is derived from the masdar of its عامل, whether the عامل is the fi'l or the ism, right? So he said جلست Majlis Zayd. I sat in the seating of Zayd. Right? And the Majlis Zayd, you're not talking about I sat as Zayd sat, but I sat in the Majlis Zayd, in the place of the gathering of Zayd. قال سبحانه وتعالى قال الله تعالى وأنا كنا حكاية عن الجن. right? وأنا كنا نقعد منها مقاعد السمع. what? sorry, what did I say? مقاعد للسمع. وأن كنا نقعد منها مقاعد للسمع. right? نقعد مقاعد للسمع. This is for the place. right? right? So it's في محل نصب. And there's some discussion on this example, you can see. وما عدا هذه الثلاثة الأنواع من أسماء المكان لا يجوز انتصابه على الظرفية. Other types of أسماء المكان cannot be put in ظرف, in نصب, insofar as they are ظرف مكان. So you say جلست البيت, فلا تقول جلست البيت. Right? Because it does not fulfill these three criteria. Because it is not مبهم, it's اسم مقدار, it's not مشتق من مصدر عامله. right? So the أسماء المكان المعين, so for example, one of the things is مكان المختص, a specific place, is not ظرف زمان, ظرف مكان. You just say جلست في البيت. صليت المسجد. No, you say صليت في المسجد. right? قمت الطريق. Like الطريق is specific. So a good sign of it being specific is التعريف. Right? With respect to place. But the مختص does apply in the ظرف الزمان. مختص مبهم and what's the third? And المبين للعدد. What's it called? المعدود. ولكن حكمه أن تجره بفي. Rather, what you do with other than these three types of أسماء مكان is that you put them in jar with fi. So you say صليت في المسجد, etc. But then there's a problem. Because مما سمع من العرب, right, from what the Arabs say, and this is not قياس, right, this is, things like this خلاف الأصل, so you need right, مما سمع من العرب وقولهم, and they're saying, meaning the Arabs saying, the classical Arabs did say things like دخلت المسجد. سكنت البيت. It's problematic. because it's a specific place. So could this be a dharf? The qiyas is that it shouldn't be, right? So it's mansoob ala, they say this mansoob ala tawassu', right? This being expansive in usage. It's a khilaf al-qiyas, right? بإسقاط الخافض, right? By dropping the khafid, right? And the Arabs did that. Sometimes they dropped the harf al-jar, right? 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 And there is, so they say, so فالأصل in دخلت المسجد is الأصل دخلت في المسجد وسكنت في البيت, right? فحذف الجار, so the jar was omitted, right? يعني, right? And then they differed on the i'rab, right? So saying that what's afterwards, so we say دخلت المسجد, this is that its grammatical state is that it, so we say it's mansoob على التوسع, right? That's how they'd say it. And that's al-Farisi, one of the early great grammarians. Al-Farisi held this, and this was chosen by Ibn Malik. Ibn Malik ascribed it to Sibawayh, which is always a big argument, but that's right. وقيل إنه منصوب على الظرفية, right? And there's this is another, so there's several ways this is right? So this is not done generally. It's theoretically possible to apply to other than this, but it goes back to usage, right? It goes back to usage, right? Right? So we need caution regarding it, right? That don't experiment with this dropping the fee, right? Right? So you say jalastu al-kursiyya. The other thing, you didn't just lose a harf jar, but you lost your language there, right? Right. So then he says al-maf'ul min ajlihi, right? باب المفعول من أجله ويسمى المفعول لأجله. This is again one of the straightforward chapters. It's a brief chapter. ويسمى المفعول لأجله والمفعول له وهو الاسم المنصوب الذي يذكر بيانا لسبب وقوع الفعل. Right? Right? So it's a maf'ul that comes to explain why the fi'l happens. نحو قام زيد إجلالا لعمر. Zayd stood out of reverence to Amr. So إجلالا is مفعول من أجله. As if you say قام زيد لأجل من أجل الإجلال لعمر. Right? قصدتك ابتغاء معروفك. قصدتك من أجل ابتغاء معروفك. Right? ويشترط كونه مصدرا واتحاد زمانه وزمان عمله. Because what happens, this is the meaning for which you did the action. Right? It's the meaning for which you did the action. So what is the type of word that expresses meanings on their own? The meanings of actions? Masdar. So that's why it's a masdar. And this is why you did it. So it's connected to like intention. So اتحاد زمنه وزمان عامله. Right? Like, can you say يعني قام زيد ثم إجلالا لعمر. Right? Right? That he stood up and then he decided that he had stood up out of reverence? No. Right? The ijlal would have to be at the time of the qiyam for it to be min ajlihi. So this, right? كما تقدم في المثالين وكقوله سبحانه وتعالى ولا تقتلوا أولادكم, do not kill your children, خشية إملاق, أي من أجل خشية إملاق, out of fear of poverty. Right? يعني الإملاق هو شدة الفقر والفاقة, or just الفاقة. Right? Right? وقوله تعالى ينفقون أموالهم ابتغاء مرضات الله. They spend, ينفقون أموالهم لماذا؟ Right? This مفعول من أجله. ابتغاء مرضات الله. ابتغاء أي من أجل ابتغاء مرضات الله. Right? This is the why. It's a ابتغاء is a masdar and it takes place at the time of the action. And it explains why the action took place. And sometimes it can be tricky to identify from the other ones. Right? And the word ibtigha is a very interesting word. For ibtigha is the ifta'ala from baghi. Right? And baghi has a very negative meaning. That's why the baghi can be negative. The bughat are those who go out against the ruler. But there's also a very positive meaning of it. Baghi al-khair salli ala Muhammad. Very famous qasida. Right? But ibtigha comes up in the Quran. Ibtigha'a mardatillah. Elsewhere in the Quran, yeah. No, but that's a negative use. But there's other. Ibtigha'a ridwanillah. Right? Right? So these words, build up your vocabulary as we come through these words, right? You can see, that's why, it's a good opportunity to look up in like Raghib and others. ولا يجوز تأهبت السفر لعدم اتحاد الزمان. I prepared for the travel. Why? Because السفر could not be a مفعول من أجله. I prepared for the travel, because the preparing is before the travel. لعدم اتحاد الزمان. So you say تأهبت أي تجهزت. You say للسفر. ولا جئتك محبتك إياي. I came because of your love for me. Right? Why? Because the love preceded the coming. لعدم اتحاد الفاعل. Right? And also because I came because of your, بل يجب جره باللام. تقول تأهبت للسفر وجئتك لمحبتك إياي. That's a مفعول من أجله. And then you have the مفعول معه. Right? The مفعول معه is very straightforward. Then we have the hal and the tamyiz. And most people, their hal, with respect to the hal, is the hal of tahayyur. And when it comes to tamyiz, they have bad tamyiz. Right? right? They're but tamyiz, right? They're ill-mannered grammatically when it comes to tamyiz. A basic question that you should be able to answer by now: what distinguishes the hal and the tamyiz? And then we'll open the next class with that. What distinguishes the hal and the tamyiz? How do you analyze that? You need to know what is the hal, you need to know what is the tamyiz, and what are the points of distinction. Because one is they have certain things in common, but what are the points of distinction? So where does the hal apply? Where does the tamyiz apply? Okay? How can you tell one apart from the other? So the hal and the tamyiz need, and there's a little extra detail here, but we'll begin with the big picture regarding them, the hal and the tamyiz, and I'll be asking you about them. So we'll take next week these three things: the maf'ul ma'ahu, the hal and the tamyiz. نسأل الله أحسن الحال وأن يفقهنا في الدين حتى نميز بين ما ينفعنا وما يضرنا في ديننا ودنيانا، وأن يجعلنا وإياكم من أميز عباده وأحبهم وأنفعهم وأقربهم إليه وإلى حبيبه المصطفى صلى الله عليه وسلم أميز عباده عليه الصلاة والسلام. So we stop at the maf'ul ma'ahu, correct? Okay. So we'll stop there bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, and then we'll have our next class as scheduled. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Yeah.
Why does Sahib al-Mutammima change the order here of the abwab?
Good question.
Why does he do taqdeem of these maf'uls over the hal, tamyiz, and istithna?
Because this is a more logical order. Because these are more directly kind of, they're if you look in al-Ahdal's commentary, he explains why the order is the way it is. Right? There's also a commentary by a contemporary scholar. There's a really large commentary, which it's good, but it's like everything and the kitchen sink kind of commentary. It's like a sharh on the Fawakih al-Janiyya, but alhamdulillah. But I'm not necessarily recommending it, but it's useful to have there. It's called al-Durratul Bahiyya ala Mutammima al-Ajrumiyya. I'm not recommending the author nor anything about it, but it has its merits. It doesn't hurt to right. It has clear merits. If you can find copies, I don't know if it's online. Ad-Durratul Bahiyya ala Mutammima al-Ajrumiyya al-Wassabi. I believe he's a contemporary. Okay. So we'll continue. I have to jump in, address a few things, and then start the next class at next time. Sheikh Yusuf's doing the. Yeah. So could you just liaise with him about what's going on?